The trouble began quietly, the way conflicts in suburban neighborhoods often do, first as a murmured complaint, then as a passive-aggressive note, and finally as an official letter printed on authoritative HOA letterhead. Noah Lewis had lived in the wooded, meticulously maintained community of Ridgeview Crest for nearly 4 years, and in all that time he had barely interacted with the HOA beyond paying dues and receiving monthly newsletters about lawn height and community potlucks. He was an engineer by profession, a quiet type by nature, and someone who preferred order, routine, and the peaceful hum of his newly purchased Tesla Model while charging in his garage each night. When Noah first installed the Level 2 charger on the interior wall of his garage, he believed he was simply taking a small, responsible step toward modern convenience. The charger was safe, certified, and fully permitted by the city. It was tucked neatly beside his workbench, connected to a dedicated circuit, and barely noticeable to anyone walking past his property. In fact, no one could see it at all, unless someone had been lingering close enough to peek into his half-open garage door on a day he forgot to close it completely. For the first few weeks, nothing happened. Noah followed his routine. Work, gym, home, plug in the car, cook dinner, unwind. The EV charger glowed with a soft white light each evening, indicating a steady flow of energy. It was peaceful, predictable, exactly how Noah liked things. But in Ridgeview Crest, anything new that deviated from the long-standing norms often triggered unease. Many homeowners were older, many clung tightly to traditional ways, and many believed the HOA existed to prevent the neighborhood from changing too much. Of course, no rule explicitly mentioned electric vehicles or home chargers. The community had been built in the early 2000s when hybrids were still rare and EVs were a novelty more than a lifestyle. Nobody had updated the rulebook in over a decade. Everything shifted on a stormy Thursday evening. Noah returned home in heavy rain, splashing through puddles, and hurried into the garage before shutting the door behind him. He plugged in his Tesla as usual, listened to the relay click, and watched the familiar glow appear. Once inside, he peeled off his wet jacket, made dinner, and assumed his day was over. But he didn't notice the figure standing just beyond the curve of his driveway 30 minutes earlier, umbrella trembling as it shielded her from the wind, eyes squinted suspiciously into the dim interior of his garage. The next morning, the letter arrived. It was the first official notice Noah had received from the HOA since moving in, and it was printed in bold, unwelcoming text. It stated that a member of the HOA board had observed a non-compliant electrical installation inside Noah's garage. It warned that charging electric vehicles within residential garages posed an undefined fire and structural hazard. The letter demanded that Noah cease all EV charging activities immediately or face escalating fines. At first, Noah assumed it had to be a mistake. Perhaps the board misunderstood something. Perhaps they saw an extension cord or misinterpreted the purpose of the equipment. But as he read the letter again, slowly, he saw that the language was unambiguous. It wasn't a warning, it was a ban. Noah set the letter on his dining table, feeling the weight of disbelief settle into his chest. His charger was permitted. The installation was city-inspected. He had followed every guideline and legal requirement. And yet the HOA, an organization that had no formal training in electrical safety nor jurisdiction inside private, fully enclosed garages, had decided it could override state and city policy with a single paragraph of fear-based reasoning. Over the next few days, the situation escalated. The HOA sent a second letter, this time with a fine. Then a third letter with a larger fine and a threat of a lien should he continue violating community rules. Noah quietly paid none of them. He spent hours researching, reading, and cross-referencing state-level clean energy statutes. He discovered something significant, something that made his frustration slowly transform into resolve. His state had passed a set of clean energy laws designed to encourage EV adoption. These laws explicitly protected homeowners' rights to install and use EV chargers within their property, regardless of HOA objection. The only exceptions involved legitimate safety concerns supported by certified inspectors. Noah had documentation proving his installation passed inspection. The HOA, however, had nothing but speculation and a fear of unsightly changes, even though the charger wasn't visible from any public or common area. The more Noah learned, the more the situation began to take on a different shape. What he had originally assumed was a simple misunderstanding now looked like something rooted in control, resistance to modernization, and perhaps even personal bias. It didn't take long for him to identify the most likely culprit: Marlene Richter, the HOA president. Marlene had a reputation, one whispered at block parties and playground sidelines. She was known for enforcing rules that weren't written, resisting anything new, and believing that her version of community standards overrode logic and legality. She was meticulous about lawn ornaments, driveway cleaning schedules, trash bin placement, and any deviation from tradition. Residents often joked that Ridgeview Crest would still be using landlines if Marlene had her way. Noah had never spoken to her directly. He had only seen her a handful of times, walking briskly down the street with a clipboard and a permanent look of disapproval etched across her face. Yet now she was targeting him, or rather, targeting his quiet attempt at progress. What bothered Noah most was not the fines or the tone, or even the fact that he was being singled out. It was the principle. The idea that an HOA could fabricate a rule on the spot and wield it like a weapon, ignoring the law and disregarding common sense. It was the arrogance of believing they had authority where they absolutely did not. For the first time since moving to Ridgeview Crest, Noah felt something shift inside him. A sense that he had to stand his ground, not out of anger but out of necessity. If he let this go, if he simply unplugged his charger and accepted the fine, then what would come next? A ban on solar panels? A ban on smart thermostats? A ban on anything unfamiliar to the board's outdated sensibilities? Noah gathered every document he had: his installation permit, the city inspection report, the clean energy statutes, and several legal summaries explaining that HOAs could not restrict EV chargers without legitimate safety evidence. He printed everything neatly, organized it into folders, and prepared to attend the next HOA meeting. The air in the clubhouse on the night of the meeting was tense before Noah even walked in. Word had spread quickly. HOA conflicts always fueled gossip, and some neighbors arrived out of curiosity, others out of boredom, and a few out of a deep-seated desire to watch drama unfold. Noah took a seat, documents in hand, while Marlene presided at the front table with the rest of the board. She looked confident, ready to assert her authority. Noah remained calm. He knew the law was on his side. The meeting began, and with it, the confrontation that would set everything in motion. An event that would expose the HOA's overreach, unravel their control, and ignite a battle no one in Ridgeview Crest was prepared for. The atmosphere inside the Ridgeview Crest clubhouse shifted the moment Noah stepped toward the front table. The low hum of murmured conversations faltered, replaced by an eager silence that swept through the room like a quiet breeze. Everyone sensed that something unusual was about to unfold. Something far more compelling than the typical discussions about mulch color or seasonal flower requirements. Even the board members straightened in their chairs, some out of caution, others out of stubborn resolve. Noah placed his neatly organized folder on the table and stood facing the board. He wasn't naturally confrontational. In fact, he had always avoided neighborhood drama. But there was a steadiness in his posture, the kind that comes from knowing the truth is not just on your side, but firmly backed by the law. The board members watched him with a mix of curiosity and unease. Marlene, however, regarded him with a cold, expectant gaze, as though she believed she already knew everything he planned to say and was waiting to shut him down. She had the posture of someone accustomed to winning every neighborhood dispute, someone who believed her word was the final one. Noah's voice remained calm as he explained the legality of his EV charger installation, the steps he followed, and the relevant state and city codes that explicitly protected his right to charge his vehicle. His explanation was steady and methodical, built on facts, evidence, and official documentation. He spoke not to provoke, but to correct, to clarify the boundaries the HOA had crossed. As he laid down the city-issued approval forms and inspection certificates, some residents leaned closer, whispering to each other. They recognized the official stamps. They recognized the authority behind them. A few faces showed surprise. Others showed something closer to admiration. But Marlene's expression tightened. She sat perfectly still, her fingers interlaced, her shoulders rigid. It was clear she had expected pushback, but not this level of preparation, not a challenge fortified by state law. Yet instead of acknowledging the evidence, she countered with the full force of her authority, dismissing the documents as incomplete, insufficient, and not aligned with community standards. She insisted that the HOA had ultimate jurisdiction over all modifications within the neighborhood, including internal garage installations. She argued that the board had the responsibility to prevent anything it deemed unsafe, even without professional verification. She framed her arguments as if she were safeguarding the entire neighborhood from a looming hazard. Noah listened patiently, but beneath his calm exterior, frustration simmered. He knew Marlene's statements were not just incorrect, they were reckless. Every point she made contradicted established law. The HOA could not override city inspection approvals. The HOA could not fabricate safety claims without evidence. And most importantly, the HOA could not prohibit EV charging infrastructure protected under clean energy regulations. Yet Marlene continued, weaving her reasoning around imagined risks and speculative dangers. Some board members nodded along uncertainly, more out of habit than conviction. Others looked conflicted, glancing between Noah's documents and Marlene's unyielding glare. When Marlene concluded her argument, she leaned back in her chair, confident that her tone and authority alone would end the matter. She announced that the board would uphold the citation and fines until further review, a phrase she often used to bury issues indefinitely. But this time, her declaration met with silence, not agreement. A few members of the audience shifted uncomfortably. A couple exchanged skeptical looks. And one board member, an older man named Richard, cleared his throat softly, as though preparing to speak. But before he could raise his concerns, Marlene shot him a sharp glance, and he fell silent again. Noah took a slow breath and then laid down one final document, the one he knew would change everything. It was a printed excerpt of the state's clean energy statutes, highlighted in yellow, citing the exact section that prohibited HOAs from restricting EV charging equipment under any circumstances without certified safety justification. He let the room take it in. Some people leaned forward. Others straightened. Even the board members who had seemed indifferent now stared at the highlighted text, their expressions shifting from confidence to uncertainty. But Marlene's reaction was different. Her eyes narrowed. Her lips pressed into a hard, thin line. And for the first time, a ripple of tension moved visibly through her posture, like a crack in a polished facade. Instead of acknowledging the law, she dismissed it as misinterpreted, insisting that the HOA still had authority based on private property regulations. She claimed the board's decision was final and began moving on to the next agenda item, hoping to bulldoze through the moment before the room caught up with what had just happened. But the room didn't move on. It stayed frozen, listening, processing, and silently questioning everything they had just witnessed. When the meeting adjourned, it felt unresolved, like a storm cloud suspended over the neighborhood. Residents shuffled out, whispering rapidly, replaying the confrontation in their minds. Some approached Noah privately, offering quiet support. Others expressed confusion, wondering how the HOA could override state law. And several admitted they had long felt controlled by the board, but lacked the courage to challenge. As Noah walked home beneath dim streetlights, he felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The board hadn't listened, but the community had, and that mattered more than he anticipated. The next morning, the HOA doubled down. A new letter arrived, this time more aggressive, more demanding. It threatened escalating fines, legal action, and even suspension of community privileges. The language was forceful, designed to intimidate. It accused Noah of willful noncompliance, as though the entire conflict were his creation. But what the board didn't know was that Noah had spent the previous night researching legal firms specializing in HOA abuse cases. He had discovered more than he expected. Precedents, lawsuits, settlements, and entire forums dedicated to homeowners fighting unlawful HOA overreach. It turned out Ridgeview Crest was not the first community where a board had tried to ignore state law, and in every documented case, the law had prevailed. By noon, Noah had contacted a clean energy advocacy group recommended by a legal advisor. They were eager to help. In fact, they seemed thrilled by the opportunity, explaining that their organization had long sought an example case to highlight HOA obstruction of EV adoption. Noah had unknowingly stumbled into their exact area of interest. The group offered legal guidance, assistance in drafting an official response, and connections to attorneys who could take the case if necessary. They even hinted that a successful challenge could force the HOA to revise its entire rulebook. Noah realized then that this wasn't just about his EV charger anymore. It was about every homeowner who had ever been bullied by arbitrary rules, every resident fined for nonsense, and every person too intimidated to speak out. It was about setting a precedent. By evening, Noah had drafted a formal cease and desist notice addressed to the HOA board. It cited the relevant laws, listed the violations committed by the board, and warned them that continued harassment would result in legal action. His tone was factual, professional, and unwavering. He printed the letter and slid it into the HOA's official Dropbox. And as he walked away, he noticed something unusual. Several neighbors watching from their driveways, waiting, curious. Something was shifting in Ridgeview Crest, something bigger than anyone expected. And as Noah stepped into his home, he knew the next move would come soon, either from the HOA, desperate to reclaim control, or from the residents, quietly preparing to take sides in a battle that had only just begun. The tension in Ridgeview Crest seemed to thicken in the days that followed, settling over the community like a summer haze. Every driveway conversation drifted toward the same topic. Every early morning dog-walking circle whispered updates, and every passing glance carried the same unspoken question. How long could the HOA board withstand the pressure building against them? Noah's formal cease and desist letter had shaken the foundation more than anyone realized. The moment the board received it, panic rippled through their ranks. The language was precise, the citations irrefutable, and the consequences distinctly outlined. For the first time, the board understood that their overreach was exposed, documented, challenged, and backed by state law and external advocacy groups. Instead of responding professionally, they reacted defensively. And it showed. Within 24 hours, the HOA sent out a community-wide email, attempting to reframe the situation as a case of a resident failing to follow guidelines. The message was long, rambling, and oddly emotional. It insisted that the board was acting in the best interest of safety. It suggested that residents should trust the experience of their elected leaders. But absent from the email was any mention of the law. Absent was any discussion of the documents Noah had provided. Absent was any explanation for why a permitted, inspected charger was being labeled dangerous. Residents read between the lines. And for many, it was the final push they needed to question everything the board had ever done. By midweek, the knock on Noah's door came, not from the board, but from his neighbors. One by one, they visited, each carrying their own experiences and frustrations. Some spoke of landscaping fines for plants that were fully allowed by state conservation programs. Others described arbitrary punishments for driveway cracks, mailbox posts, or non-standard holiday decorations. A few quietly admitted they had felt the HOA was overstepping for years, but had never known how to challenge it. Noah listened, realizing the scope of the issue reached far beyond his charger. What had begun as one conflict now represented something larger, an overdue reckoning. The Clean Energy Advocacy Group, meanwhile, had moved quickly. They prepared an official letter addressed not just to the HOA board, but to the state's housing regulator as well. The letter detailed the board's unlawful actions, their dismissal of state statutes, and their retaliatory fines. It outlined the pattern of behavior and presented Noah's case as a textbook example of HOA noncompliance. Copies of the letter were provided to Noah, who forwarded them to the board. And that was when everything shifted. For the first time since the conflict began, the HOA went silent. No new fines, no new threats, no new emails. The board stopped responding altogether, leaving an uncharacteristic vacuum of authority in their wake. Residents noticed immediately. They whispered about it at mailboxes. They speculated in community group chats. Some wondered if the board was regrouping. Others suspected they were panicking. The truth was that Marlene, the HOA president, had been blindsided. She had believed her authority was absolute. She had believed her decisions were beyond question. She had believed that the neighborhood would always follow her lead. But with the possibility of state involvement, with legal documentation stacking against her, and with residents beginning to doubt her leadership openly, her confidence began to crumble. Some board members, too felt the pressure. Richard, the older member who had hesitated during the meeting, reached out to Noah privately. He explained that he had long disagreed with Marlene's heavy-handed style but had felt overshadowed. He admitted that many board votes were decided before meetings even began, with dissenting opinions quickly dismissed. What he revealed was more than dysfunction. It was a pattern of control that had flourished unchallenged for years. The turning point arrived during the next HOA meeting, a gathering so heavily attended that the clubhouse reached standing room-only capacity. Noah arrived early, but dozens of residents were already there, their expressions firm, their posture unified. This time, the board looked overwhelmed. Papers were scattered, voices trembled, and at the center of it all sat Marlene, her signature composure cracked at the edges. The meeting began, but the board could no longer steer the narrative. Residents stood to speak, not with anger, but with clarity, recounting their own experiences of unfair treatment. One after another, they shared moments when the HOA had imposed arbitrary fines or ignored formal requests for clarification. They spoke of inconsistencies, favoritism, and a pattern of decisions made without transparency. The charger dispute was no longer isolated. It had become a symbol. When Noah presented the advocacy group's letter, the room fell into a hush so deep it seemed to settle into the walls. The legal citations, the state statutes, the clear statements of unlawful action. Every word carried weight. Every point struck directly at the core of the board's authority. By the time he finished, several board members looked visibly shaken. And then, in a quiet voice barely above a whisper, Richard stood and announced his resignation. He apologized to the community. He admitted faults within the board's processes. His words were heavy with sincerity. Another board member followed suit. Then another. Each resignation brought a growing sense of collapse, like the slow toppling of pillars that had once held an unchallenged structure. Finally, the room turned to Marlene. Her face was pale, her posture rigid, her eyes darting from resident to resident as though searching for an escape route. She tried to assert her authority one last time, insisting that she had only acted for the good of the community. But the words rang hollow. There was no applause, no nods, no support. She resigned moments later, not out of grace, but because she realized she had nowhere left to stand. The fall of the board happened in minutes, but the impact of it echoed through Ridgeview Crest long after the meeting ended. A temporary committee was formed. Transparent elections were scheduled. Residents volunteered to help rewrite outdated bylaws, this time aligning them with state law and modern standards. And Noah? He returned home to find his Tesla quietly charging in the garage, exactly as it should have been from the start. In the days that followed, neighbors thanked him. Some shook his hand. Others simply smiled in passing. The conflict had changed the community, not just by removing leadership that had overstayed its welcome, but by empowering residents who had long felt powerless. The charger dispute had been the spark, but the transformation had been far larger, a reclamation of fairness, clarity, and respect. Ridgeview Crest was no longer a place ruled by outdated control, but a neighborhood finally moving into a more modern, cooperative future. And as Noah looked out over the street one evening, watching porch lights flicker on and families stroll through the warm dusk, he knew this wasn't just a personal victory. It was a reminder that even in the quietest suburbs, standing up for what's right could reshape everything.